Alright everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about critical lease dates in commercial real estate. Let's get started. So on the agenda for today, we're going to talk about 3 different sets of critical lease dates that you'll typically come across in most commercial leases. So the first is all those critical lease dates are milestones that happen before rent actually starts to get paid by the tenant. Next is those dates that occur during the lease term, and finally are those that you should keep in mind as you approach the end or the expiration of the lease. So diving right in, before rent starts, there are 4 key critical lease dates. The first is the commencement date, sometimes also known as the effective date. Next is the delivery date, or the possession date, that date which you actually hand the keys over to the tenant. Next is there a free rent period or end of free rent date? And finally is the day immediately after, when the tenant actually begins to pay rent. Let's take a look at a calendar so we can get a better idea of what these 4 look like. So let's assume that January 1st of any given year, you sign the lease with the tenant. So you sign, they sign. That is the effective date of the lease. So lease commencement is also another way to describe the effective date. So if January 1st is that date, let's say that you take almost the next month, so almost all of January, to complete renovating the space. So let's say you change the paint, you change the carpet, you change some of the fixtures, you change out the light bulbs, you change out the doorknobs and the locks. So it takes you about a month to do so, and you finish on the 31st of January. So now that construction is complete, renovation is complete, and the space is prepared and ready for the tenant to take occupancy, you hand them the keys on February 1st. That's the possession date, or the delivery date. Now, if we take this a step further, what if we assume that in an effort to entice the tenant or to encourage the tenant to occupy space in your suite and not someone else's building, you offered them 1 month free rent? So as of the date that you handed them the keys, then the clock starts. 1 full month is free. They don't start paying rent yet. So they are in the space, they are operating out of the space, they're using the space for 1 full month free. So that means March 1st is actually when rent begins, when you should expect to collect checks from the tenant. So this is the rent commencement date, a full 2 months after you signed the lease or executed the lease with the tenant. Now, if those are the critical lease dates that happen before rent commencement, let's take a look at the 3 that happen during the lease term. So the next is the escalation date, so that date on which the rent increases. Next is if there is a milestone date during which you'd have to return a portion of the security deposit. And then finally is, do they or do you as the landlord have the option to terminate that lease early, and if so, by what date? Let's take a look at each. So keep in mind that you delivered the space February 1st of the first year. So 1 year later, February 1st of the second year, the rent can escalate. So typically rent escalations happen on an annualized basis. Obviously, there are some exceptions, like step rent, but in this case, let's just assume that it happens on the anniversary date. So that means February 1st of the second year, the rent can increase. Now, what if we also assume that you negotiated with the tenant that they gave you a big security deposit? Maybe you had some concern about their creditworthiness, but after 1 full year of successful operations, you return a portion of that deposit. So if you do, on what date? In this case, we assumed 1 year later that you could refund some of that deposit. Now, what if we say that either you want or the tenant wants an early termination date? So you want to be able to kick out the tenant, or they want to be able to terminate their lease early. So if so, on what date and with how many days notice? So typically notice periods are 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, sometimes 12 months notice before being able to terminate early, to give you, the owners, some time to identify a new tenant, to try to renegotiate terms with alternative tenants. The last two critical lease dates are those that happen as you approach the end of the lease term. So, does the tenant have the right or the option to renew or extend their lease? And then finally is the date of termination or expiration itself. So, maybe on September 3rd, in the third year, they have the option to renew. And if they do, then they can renew for a certain amount of time. The renewal option is explicitly defined within the lease, and they'll typically have to give notice within a certain amount of time. So maybe 3 months out or 4 months out of the expiration of their lease, they'd have to give you, the owner, notice that they intend to renew or extend. And so finally is the lease termination or expiration date. So at the end of year 3, so now January 31st of the 4th year, at the end of year 3, the tenant has the right to vacate the space. That's the end of their lease. They no longer have the obligation and they can terminate or leave. So just to recap, these are the 3 main critical lease date categories. All those milestones that happen before rent starts, like commencement date or rent commencement date. All those that happen during the lease term, so escalation dates or maybe early termination options. And then finally, those that happen as you approach the end of the lease term, so renewal options and the actual expiration date. So I hope you found this video helpful. I look forward to talking to you soon. Take care.